this live today, we're going to be discussing the issue of whether history can ever actually be objective, whether it's a fundamental issue within history that it just never can be, and what comes with that. The issues, the debates, the discussions that need to be had when doing history, when presenting history, when studying history even. Can history ever be objective, or is it fully, solely and completely an entirely subjective issue? Now, this is an issue that has been going on, that has been raging for years, literally since history was written. It has been discussed and debated whether or not history can be objective. In fact, W.H. Walsh, who wrote a whole book called The Philosophy of History, he basically called it the most important and most baffling topic in the critical philosophy of history. And so when discussing this issue, it's important to look at a number of areas. Firstly, what is the role of a modern historian? What is a historian expected to do? Secondly, whether a modern audience actually wants an objective history. Do people who engage with history nowadays actually want history to be objective? And the extent to which the reception of history influences the methodology of the historian. Does the audience's reception of the history you create affect the way that you create history? Thirdly, the methods that a historian can use to try and achieve objectivity, and even the possibility that these very methods will actually lead to a subjective history, or probably better put, an unobjective history. So as you try to make history objective, are you in itself making it non-objective? Are you making it subjective by trying to make it objective? That's one of the issues that you need to look at. I think that this is a massive topic, a massive debate to have, and ultimately we're all going to just have our own personal conclusions about whether it's possible for history to be objective. Most likely, the conclusion that we'll come to is probably it can't be, but it's an interesting debate to have and an interesting topic to discuss. So we're going to start with the first topic that we mentioned, what is the role of a modern historian? How has this role changed over time? And whether we can draw any conclusions from that as to whether historians should be prioritizing objectivity in their writing of history. Ultimately, with the question of objectivity, the role of a historian is open to debate and different interpretations. For every culture, every society, every time period, the role of a historian is going to be fundamentally different. As an example of this, it's most easily seen in the great ancient historians, people like Herodotus, Livy, Thucydides. Most of the ancient historians were very clear about the way that they were writing history, why they were writing history, and the methods they used to do it. Herodotus was known as the father of history, and he began to write history with the main goal of preservation. And he explains in his book, in a preface to his histories, that he was publishing his work in the hope that he would preserve from decay the remembrance of what men have done. Herodotus was writing for preservation. He wanted to record what happened. He wanted to relay the facts and make sure that nothing was lost. Now, this is, I guess you could say, symptomatic of the ancient Greek culture, that so much of what they did, so much of who they were, and the cultural significance of what had gone before. And Herodotus was playing into this. Herodotus was writing history so that the stories of the men, the great women, the great explorers, adventurers, warriors, kings, queens, wouldn't be lost. He wanted to record what happened, relay the facts, and make sure nothing was lost. Now, this might sound like the most objective form of history, right? Because you're just relaying your history. You're just relaying the facts. But the issue is, and we'll discuss the issue with this later, but this seems to be objective because you're just relaying the facts, you're gathering facts, you're gathering information to present the story of what happened before. This seems objective, right? This doesn't seem like you're putting your own opinion in there. You're not putting in your own biases or anything like that. But if you continue to read Herodotus, if you continue to read his histories, you can see that even this goal, even this endeavor was laced with bias. Even if we just read the second half of the sentence, we can see he writes that his goal is to prevent the great and wonderful actions of the Greeks and the barbarians from losing their due meed of glory. So he's not just writing to present the facts. Instead, he is writing to save the stories, to stop them being lost, but to make sure that they are glorified, to make sure that they are getting their due meed of glory. Herodotus set out to preserve the stories of Greeks and barbarian greatness so that they might be praised. So his aim of just relaying the facts, of just saying what happened, seems to be objective, but this is not objective. This is subjective, because what you're doing is you are getting facts, you are collecting stories, you are collecting information for the purpose of people seeing this and going, we need to praise that person. We need to give that person the glory that they are seemingly due. So, even in this, it is subjective, it is unobjective. Herodotus does seem to try and make it seem as if his goal is still objective. He said that he is obliged to record the things he is told, but he is not required to believe them. This is an interesting thing, that he's going to relay stories, he's going to relay facts in inverted commas. He's going to relay all these things, whether he believes them to be true or not. This is interesting because this would suggest that he's being objective, that he's just taking the facts, the stories, and just putting them out there. This seems to be objective. But the problem is that it's just not objective. He's not going to let his own opinion bias this. He's not going to let his own opinion bias this, but the problem is he still does. Because he's not going to let the biases of the culture, the society, the era to stop influencing his history. The biases of culture, society, and era are still going to be influencing the history that he writes. The ancient Greek world had a massive hero culture. Much of their mythology was about heroes. You look at Homer with the Odyssey and the Iliad. These were just stories about heroes. And so it's the hero culture that he is in. It is the hero culture that he's been brought up in. And it's the hero culture that he is writing about and 4. So history, we can see, began with the aim of recording events so that the future generations would not miss out on hearing about the glory of their predecessors and the events that unfolded in the past. For Herodotus, the role of the historian was more like that of a reporter, collating and presenting the events so that they were not lost. Now, the next great historian that we come across in the ancient world was Thucydides. Now, Thucydides was a historian who had actually personally come into contact with Herodotus. He had actually come into contact with Herodotus. He had heard Herodotus speak. Thucydides wrote with more of an intention to teach rather than to preserve. For him, the role of the historian was as a teacher. As he explains in his history of the Peloponnesian War, he aimed not to write down the first story that came his way, not even to be guided by his own impressions, but to give a factual reporting of the events of the war. Again, this sounds objective, right? This sounds like you're collecting facts, you're collecting stories, and you're just putting it out there for people to engage with. This sounds like objective history. Thucydides wanted to remove all the romance of the telling of events. He wanted to work without the issue of morality. He didn't want to sit there and question whether the soldiers and the leaders were doing the right thing. He wanted to be a lot more analytical. Some have credited, therefore, Thucydides with the creation of modern history, because there is this perception that history is more analytical, that you're not telling stories, you're just getting the facts out. Thucydides even addresses the issue of bias in his writing. He says, either I was present myself at the events that he describes, or he heard them from eyewitnesses whose reports I have checked with as much thoroughness as possible. Not that even so the truth was easy to discover. Different eyewitnesses give different accounts of the same events, speaking out of bias towards one side or the other, or else from imperfect memories. So it's fascinating that Thucydides here is even mentioning bias. He's engaging with the issue that he faces as a historian. He's saying, I was there at events, or I got information from eyewitnesses, but he's acknowledging the fact that eyewitness testimonies can oftentimes be influenced by what's going on around them at the time, what they've learned since the event, or just the fact that memories are often flawed. So he edited his work to try and remove the bias from the telling of his events. But even in this, a bias can be found. Thucydides wrote with the intention of teaching. He wanted to inform the readers of events and how those events should show them how to live, act, or think. So now he's taking history and making, so this is kind of ironic, right? This is kind of interesting that he says he wants to write history without morality being an issue. But he then puts morality in by using history as a tool to teach people how to live. Interesting. So he led to the editing of events in order to present them in a teachable way. For example, the speeches that he recorded, he used the general sense of words and expressed them in words that he thought the orator should have used. Words that would present him with a teachable moment, so to speak, and would get to the lesson that he wanted to pass on. So this is another issue that historians as a whole, whether ancient or modern, needs to contend with. History is designed to be taught. when you're doing history, when you're presenting history, you're trying to teach people about the past. That's a bias in itself. So how do you navigate doing history with the bias of making it teachable? So the next great ancient historian was Livy. Livy wanted to combine the two roles that we just looked at with preservation from Herodotus and the teaching of Thucydides with a third bias, I guess you could say, a third role of the historian, which was entertainment. Livy wanted to preserve the events in such a way that the reader could be entertained and taught through them. So the role of the historian we see is now threefold. They are a preserver, they are a teacher, and they are an entertainer with all that they do with their history. So he explains in his book, A History of Rome, that, I've got the quote here, "I am aware that for historians to make extravagant claims is, and always has been, all too common. Every writer on history tends to look down his nose at the less cultivated predecessors, happily persuaded that he will better them in point of style or bring new facts to light. But however that may be, I shall find satisfaction in contributing, not, I hope, ignobly, to the labour of putting on record the story of the greatest nation in the world." Now, this is an interesting statement for historians nowadays to interact with as well. So often we do tend to look back at historians and go, well, I could do it better, or I'm going to find out a new part of this history that's never been told before, or whatever. And in a lot of cases, that's true. In a lot of cases, that's very true, especially nowadays with the increasing focus and priority on getting the minority histories or the overlooked histories, or the kind of technical term is the silenced histories, getting those out, bringing those to light. We can often look back and go, well, they did bad history back then. That might not be the case. They might be doing very good history, but they didn't tell the full story. And so this is an interesting statement for historians to wrestle with. But for Livy, he aimed not to outdo his predecessors, as many had done before, but he wanted to add his voice in a sort of choir of historical writing. This is where we can see his historical bias. He was a Roman writing about his home nation, his home empire at the time of the empire. He aimed to write about the greatest nation in the world. I mean, if that doesn't tell you what his bias was, we're all missing the point. Because he's saying Rome is the greatest nation in the world, and he's going to write their story. That is his bias, this feeling of superiority to other nations, other peoples, other empires. The Romans were the best, in Livy's view, and he was going to write the story of these better people. So he wrote as a member of what he viewed as a superior culture and empire. And this bled into his work. He presented every event that he recounted as part of a grand story of Roman dominance and superiority. Like for Thucydides, history was a teachable moment where you could learn how to live better. For Livy, it seems, history was a teachable moment to show you how the Romans are better than you. He also presents what he calls the sinking of the foundations of morality. So his work was aimed at teaching the readers about the morals that he thought, and that wider Roman society thought, were right. Livy wanted to recount the events of his nation, entertain the reader as he did, and teach them about the morals and values he thought a person ought to have. Now, in Livy, we see that all three roles of the historian are joined together: reporter, preserver, teacher, and entertainer. So when you take all three of these and you try and be a historian, it's very difficult to balance all three of these and try and be objective. All three, as has been shown in those ancient historians that we already looked at, leads to having a bias. For a modern historian, when you look at the modern world and the world in which we live, for the modern historian, the role of a reporter has become less paramount. It's less of a priority to be a reporter. Social media, news media, blogs, and podcasts have made the recording of history almost an everyday thing. People are recording their own history. Back in the day, with Herodotus, Thucydides, and Livy, they were recording history pretty much as it happened to preserve the stories of their people, because no one else was doing it. Nowadays, people are recording their own stories. People are recording their own histories, and it will be the historian's role to look at that and to make history from that. No longer is a historian required to write about what life was like for an ordinary person. A reader can simply scroll back in their timeline or that of a friend or a stranger and better understand what was happening a few years ago. Unlike the ancient historian, where they might be the only source of the preservation of history, nowadays everyone is an inadvertent preserver of history. Everyone is recording and preserving history, whether they realize it or not. With the role of a historian now being an entertainer or preserver, objectivity is a necessary casualty. In order to teach, history needs to be presented in such a way that people can learn from it. Right? It just makes sense. You are going to be looking, how do I present this in a way that people can learn whatever I'm trying to teach them? Whether it's, look at this person, we can learn from their mistakes. So you're going to be highlighting their mistakes. Look at this group of people, we can learn leadership from them. So you're pulling out all the certain leadership things. So your bias is now, history is teachable, we're going to present it in such a way that history can be learned from. In order to entertain, history needs to be presented in a way where people reading it can enjoy it. We have a massive rise in a genre of writing called narrative non-fiction, which is basically fictionalized non-fiction books. So you're presenting facts, you're presenting the real life stories of historical people and events, but you are fictionalizing them, you are dramatizing them, you are adding dialogue or characterizations that we don't find in the historical record, but you're making it engaging, you're making it accessible, you're making it enjoyable for the readers. These two biases become very, very difficult to contend with. They become very difficult to defeat. The modern historian is forced to edit, decide upon, and remove content from their work in order to present them as either teachable or as entertaining. So you're not going to include the boring stories of them looking at maps for 4 hours trying to figure out where to go. That's just a ridiculous example. But you're not going to include 4 chapters on how they decided to go where they went. You're probably going to summarize that and go, they looked at the maps, or something like that. You're going to summarize it, you're going to condense it so that the narrative can continue. You're going to skip over certain events, certain things, certain people, because either they're boring, they're uninteresting, or They just don't fit the narrative that you're trying to tell. I recently watched the trailer for the new Lord of the Rings Rings of Power show. And even in that, I mean, I'm showing here that I'm a massive nerd, but even in that, you see this massive condensing of time. They're taking a story that's spread over hundreds of years and condensing it down to fit in a few episodes of a TV show. A lot of narrative nonfiction, a lot of history nowadays is doing a similar thing. They'll condense stories to fit in the narrative or the time frame that they want to talk about. So, objectivity is unachievable when the role of the modern historian requires a bias to enact their role. The role of the modern historian at its core doesn't allow for complete objectivity. If it did, then we wouldn't have to edit, we wouldn't have to do all these things to make it entertaining or make it teachable. Objectivity is impossible if the role of a modern historian is what we've already discussed. So this directly leads us into the second point that we were going to talk about, which is audience perception, audience reception, and its effects on the methodologies of the historian. Nowadays, all around us, everywhere, the internet, social media, creates this constant striving for new, exciting, and engaging media. And this is good, it keeps your attention going, but it also has reduced humans' attention spans. It's forced every news outlet, every media outlet as a whole, news, publishing, writing, TV, film, to shorten and condense their content to make it more digestible, quicker to view, and more engaging to the modern audience. Why do you think things like TikTok or Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts have become such a popular form of media? It's because they're short, they're pithy, they're concise, and they give you a hit of content, a little dopamine fix, and you can move on. You can consume a lot more content because all the content is shorter. Ty Kiesel, an author, a writer, he explains that Twitter users need to make their point in 140 characters or less. USA Today, Fox News, and others have actually shortened their stories to make them quickly digestible, and even media outlets like CNN rely on the attractiveness of their news anchors to keep people's attention. This has had a profound effect on the writing and presentation of history as well. History now needs to be quicker to understand, more entertaining, and less time-consuming. If you ask someone to read one of the great epic histories, like Edward Gibbon's History of Rome, you ask them to read that, the immediate answer is going to be, well, no, I'm not going to do that. Because it's long, it's cumbersome, it's heavy. But if you say, right, watch this 15-second video explaining this little aspect of Roman history, they're much more likely to say yes. Now, this is a formidable bias that modern historians, to be honest, there's an exception when it comes to academics and university professors when they're writing for their peers, for other professors, for other academics, or for their students. But it is a massive issue for public historians. It's a massive issue for those who are creating and publishing history that is for consumption by the wider public, by the non-academic people. So this might be quite a cynical view. This might be a cynic's view of modern historiography. Historians, in order to sell books, papers, or TV documentaries, have seemingly been forced to surrender any chance of reaching true objectivity to make a living. I understand that sounds very cynical, but it speaks to the world that we live in now. You have to make history that is engaging. You have to make history that is exciting, entertaining, or people are not going to want to watch it. People are not going to want to interact with it. You've seen this with how documentaries have changed over the years. In the past, you'd have someone like Simon Sharma or David Starkey, who we shouldn't mention anymore, Mary Beard. You'd have people like that wandering around great historical sites, looking at ruins, looking at architecture, and talking about it. Nowadays, it's more historical drama than it is historical documentary. You have all the really dramatic reenactors, the dramatic reconstructions of the events, the battles, the people, and so it's more like a narrated historical drama than it is a historical documentary. And this is the way that media has shifted. This is the way that media has changed over time. So Ron Bryant basically explains that history as a profession, history as a job, people getting paid to do history, is actually quite a new idea. It's a relatively modern invention. He explains, the academic historian, trained in a specific field of historical study, appears as a newcomer to an old discipline. This is not to say that the quality of history has decreased, as quality is dependent on the era in which you live, but is to say that the demands of making a living out of writing history have left no room for the true pursuit of complete objectivity. A modern audience doesn't want to be presented with cold, hard facts. They want to be engaged, entertained, and informed all at the same time. It is a difficult new role to balance, with the pursuit of objectivity becoming a quaternary priority of the modern historian. It's fourth place in the priorities. It's an outlier in the priorities of a modern historian. Objectivity might not be something that anyone truly strives for anymore, because by striving for it, you might actually be hindering people's engagement with the history that you are creating. So perhaps this presents us with a new possibility. Maybe a new role has emerged for a modern historian, that of what we're going to call an invoker or a conjurer, a person who writes history that makes the reader feel as though they are there. They compose a history that vividly retells the past so as to make it accessible, engaging, and compelling. John Guy wrote a biography of Thomas Becket. I've got his book upstairs. And the reviews on this book encapsulate this idea, this role of a modern historian. The reviews read, wonderfully moving and subtle, compelling, superb storytelling, giving us a tactile visual feel for early medieval England, and vivid and extremely readable. This is symptomatic, or this is speaking to the position and role of a modern historian, where they are expected to make history that is engaging, that is vivid, that is visceral, that is readers are brought into the world. They are surprised and shocked and carried away into this world of history because it feels like they are there. Christopher Blake, a writer, muses that it is still inevitable that what is written must be relative to the tastes, customs, and prejudices of the creative moment. We've seen this hugely in the last few years. with a massive rise in histories about the empire, about its effects on our culture, our society, and us today. And this was really catalyzed by the bringing down of the Colston statue, by the Black Lives Matter events that went on, and by this increased focus on our imperial history, bringing to light the fact that we were big contributors to the slave trade, massive contributors to the slave trade, that we were massive components of events that we probably wouldn't rejoice in nowadays. And so history is almost reactive. Maybe it's better to say that history is responsive to the cultural, political, or as Christopher Blake says, creative moment. History will respond. The writing of history will respond to what is needed at the time. Us historians may add the values and the needs of the time of the historian who writes it to the list of biases. The values, desires, interests of the world, our culture, wherever we're from, are directly going to influence and affect the history that we write. Why do you think we see so many documentaries about the Tudors? So many books, so many documentaries, so many TV shows about that gets written, because that's what people want to see. I just need to plug my phone in quickly. Or historian, the role of a historian is a vocation, it is a job. People are going to write the history that will, rather cynically, will make them money. I was at a history festival about a month ago now, Chalk Valley History Festival. You have to go. This is not an ad, we're not sponsored, but Chalk Valley History Festival, you need to go. If you like history, if you're interested in history, you need to go to the Chalk Valley History Festival. It's the best. But I was at Chalk Valley History Festival and I was talking to an editor of a history magazine. And we were just talking about historical content, making history, all that kind of stuff. And he said, yeah, well, if you want to become popular, if you want to make a little bit of money, if you want to get the views and the clicks and all that kind of stuff, if you want to get the followers, write something about the Tudors. Write something about the world wars, because that is what people most readily engage with. And nowadays, the minority histories, the history of the oppressed, those stories that haven't been told as much, those are the big stories that people are focusing on now. That's the history that people are focusing on. And this is admirable. This is good. This is not bad. But it's interesting to note that this is a bit of a bias that is coming into history. You're not going to just present objective history now because you're going to be writing history that focuses on those topics and interests that are culturally relevant. Not always a bad thing, but definitely something that we need to engage with and discuss. The role of the modern historian and the perception and reception of the modern audience has placed demands on the new professional historian that makes the pursuit of true objectivity almost impossible. So, what do? Do we try and remove subjectivity from our work? This is going to be the next topic that we're going to discuss, is removing subjectivity from our work. And the issue is, as you try to remove subjectivity from your work, that in itself becomes a bias. James wrote, it's like the rest of our commercialized culture. It's true. So much of our culture is affected by the interests and values and things like this that are prevalent in our wider culture. And so much of our output, whether we're historians or artists or musicians or we're writers, whatever we are, so much of our content is dictated by the cultural values, interests, and priorities of the world around us. And so it's a really interesting issue to engage with. Thank you, James, for bringing that up. But what's interesting is as you try to remove subjectivity from your work, as you try to pursue objective history, the removal of subjectivity becomes a bias in itself. Now, we'll break this down a little bit. Objectivity has been a feature of history that might be less demanded than it was before, even to the point of being refused by the modern historian. And this is something that we touched on earlier, and something that James really brought up, is the fact that audiences don't want objective history. They don't want the objective history. They want history that interacts with and deals with the issues that are culturally prevalent. So they want to know about Britain's involvement in the slave trade. They want to know about the history of ethnic minorities in this country. They want to know women's history. All these things that haven't necessarily been talked about on a wider scale. They want to know these. And so if you just present an objective history, they will refuse that and disregard it because they want a subjective history. They want a focused history, a almost, I guess in a sense you could say, personalized history that they can engage with and can help inform. And again, it's not always a bad thing. Not always a bad thing. But sometimes it can lead to history being written that is dangerous, that is false, that is misleading. And we've seen this many times. There was a history book written about how homosexuality was illegal, and the historian basically made the claim that homosexual men were executed. They were hung for being homosexual. And the problem was she had completely misread the court records. She'd got it completely wrong. And the sentence designation did not mean execution. In fact, it meant that it was kind of a sentence of execution, but it was commuted. So they weren't executed. But she made this whole case, this whole claim that these homosexual men were executed, and they weren't, unfortunately. She got it all wrong. When I say unfortunately, I mean that it's unfortunate that she was doing bad history, not unfortunately that they weren't executed. That could be a massive point of contention. I'm not saying that at all. It's unfortunate that she did bad history. That is a massive shame, and because the rest of the book was quite interesting. It's awful that she did bad history. But anyway, so the removal of subjectivity in the work can become a bias in itself. So we'll dig into this a little bit. Despite the want for quick, readable, understandable history, the modern audience doesn't want... Oh, we're dead. Oh, we collapsed. Hang on, we're back. We collapsed. This is your phone on something. There we go. We're back. And we're zoomed in. Great. We keep falling. This is very high. I should get a stand instead. There we go. We're back. I think we should be okay now. Here we go. Okay. They do not want to read a book that is more political, ideological, or religious tirade than actual history. We've got some more comments. It is also frustrating how political the choice of who can be discussed seems to be. This is also true. Historiography has become massively politicized. the history that gets promoted, the books that get promoted, the historians that get listened to. Sorry, I'm just trying to work this out. This is not going well. The history that has been promoted and discussed and talked about is massively politicized. Who we listen to, who we're not allowed to listen to, who's cancelled, who's not cancelled. This is all very political nowadays, and even something like cancel culture itself makes history incredibly political. But I think that's endemic of the whole culture as well, because you would have a massive, you could have massive conversations, and there's this huge tendency to just revert to, oh, well, they don't agree with me, therefore they're Nazis. There's always this comparison. There's a term for it, which I can't remember at the moment, but there's this tendency to just revert back to, oh, they're Nazis. Oh, comparing this person to Hitler or that person to Hitler, when comparisons like that are just, on the whole, usually very incorrect. But history becomes so politicized. Who's in power? Who is in control of the media? Whatever it is, history can become very, very politicized, and it's a real issue. James comes back with, here in the US, colonial history is popular, but the Civil War really sells. Yeah, exactly. And I think we will see a rise, or we have seen a rise in the Civil War histories, because it speaks directly to our current climate. It speaks directly to the political situations that we find ourselves in, where race relations are very taut, very contentious, that there's a real head-to-head going on currently, which we see with things like critical race theory. We see it with the people that have been elected previously. We see it with radical groups on both sides. That race relations have become really contentious, and so the history that becomes popular again is the history that speaks directly to the cultural situation that we find ourselves in. And so historians are going to be writing history that engages with the political and cultural climate that we find ourselves in, because they know that's going to be popular. Now, again, this has to be said, it's not always a bad thing. Writing the histories of people who have overcome awful treatment with segregation or something like the Holocaust or events like that, it is a good thing to write the stories of the people who overcame all these issues. But there is an issue that history can become so completely about the events that they overlook the rest of history. They start to make claims or generalizations. My dog is being very loud. They start to make claims or generalizations that might be misleading, or potentially even outright false about historical events and situations, because they're trying to pander to the cultural or political situation that they find themselves in. So, yeah, there's a whole thing to be said here. There's a whole issue to really dive into. But with history, you can write history that eventually becomes more of a political, ideological, or religious tirade than an actual history. No one is picking up a history book wanting to read someone's manifesto. But unfortunately, history can become a bit like that. Within the atmosphere of limited attention spans and constrained histories, modern audiences still demand a level of objectivity that prevents a work becoming a manifesto. So there is a sense in which the public are demanding an objective history that means that it's not just your religious, political, ideological views put on a page and labelled as history. There is this desire, there is this want for that. So you need to balance a world that doesn't want objective history and a world that demands a certain extent of objective history. And this balance is incredibly difficult to strike. But this is something that we need to discuss. In order to pursue this formidable balance, the removal of subjectivity, the removal of biases, is what is required. When a historian embarks on removing biases from their work, they are inevitably forced to use their own subjectivity to determine what is a bias or not. Now, this leads to a very interesting issue, especially with something like religious biases, where a historian can read their work, they can edit their work, they can proofread it, dig into it, whatever. They can try and remove all evidences of their religious biases from their work, but they're using their own subjective opinion to do it. They're using their own subjective understanding of what is a bias to remove biases from their work. So to one person, it might look like a massive, glaring red flag in the work of, this is massive religious bias. You're basically just making a religious argument here. But to the historian, it might not look like that, because it's just their natural view. It's just naturally what they believe anyway. And so you're using your subjective opinion, your subjective perception of the world to try and remove subjectivity from your work. This is difficult. Thucydides, we go back to him. Thucydides used his personal subjectivity to discern which eyewitness testimonies were biased, and modern historians are required to do the same thing. Subjectivity always comes into play when you're writing history. You are forced to weigh up. You're forced to weigh up what is right, what is not right, what you believe to be true, what you believe not to be true, and that will inform and impact the history that you write. Exactly. James said, we write about our own interests and biases. Yeah, exactly. A historian will focus on a certain period because they're interested in it. They will write about a certain thing because it's what they're interested in it. It's because they find it interesting, because they're engaged with it. In the West, we've got another comment. In the West, with largely Christian history, we tend to regard the Crusades as an act of barbarism. Exactly. This is something interesting. This is historical interpretation. How do we interpret the events that have gone before? So it's interesting, we see a prime example of this is Winston Churchill. Prime example of this is Winston Churchill. Now, I will preface this by saying that I'm not giving any of my own political, religious, ideological views when discussing this. But Winston Churchill is a fascinating case to look at when it comes to how political climates and circumstances affect our interpretation of history. Back in the day, Winston Churchill was viewed as this great war leader, this great hero of the British people, the true Briton. He was lauded and respected and worshipped almost and praised for his work. And everyone kind of just overlooked the racism and eugenics and all that kind of stuff. They overlooked that, and he was praised and lauded and was hugely well respected. As time goes on and the political situations change, as political circumstances change, nowadays you can't talk about Winston Churchill without someone bringing up the fact that he was racist, or bringing up the fact that he was heavily involved in eugenics, and we were this close to having eugenics as law in this country, which is a fascinating topic and some for another time. But you can't talk about Winston Churchill without someone bringing that up now. And this is symptomatic of how historical interpretation changes over time in a response to the cultural, political, and ideological views of the wider culture that is around you. So it's interesting. So the issue is that subjectivity, removing subjectivity, is in itself a subjective act. In order to remove subjectivity, editorial subjectivity is required. Is this not just another form of bias? It is important at this juncture, at this question, to understand what we mean by bias and objectivity. So a bias is any kind of political, ideological, religious, cultural, societal, or original subjectivity that comes into the writing and presentation of history. This may take the form of editorial subjectivity, the way and location in which history is presented, the era, the wider political situation, or the international context of the time. True objectivity, therefore, is the removal of these biases and the presentation of history without the tinge of any kind of influence or angle. But the issue is, we come back to it, the issue is, to remove these subjective biases, subjectivity is required to be employed. There is a very little possibility of subverting these biases without using subjective discernment to do so. Thereby meaning that in order to remove all biases from a piece of work, a new bias needs to be employed, thereby tinging the work with that bias even if you've removed all the other biases. By removing historical biases, it becomes a bias in itself. We've got a comment here saying, do they make stuff up to make it more fun? Sometimes. Sometimes they do. Sometimes there's a genre, we spoke about this a little bit earlier, but there's a genre called narrative non-fiction, where they basically take the real events, the real stories, the real people, and they dramatize it. And in some cases, they actually fictionalize it to make it more engaging, more vivid, visceral, more exciting in some cases. So in some cases, they do make stuff up to make it more fun, more exciting. And obviously that's awful. That's bad history. We do not condone or support or add anything to do with that. We hate that. You don't need to make stuff up. The history itself is fascinating and incredible and exciting. Me and my brother, we talk about fiction all the time. We're both writers and we talk about fiction. And, we talk about the fact that you come up with any supervillain from fiction and we can find you someone in history that was either equally as bad or even worse, but was real. And so there's no need to make things up. At some points there are pieces of dialogue that we just don't have. And, you do get a little bit of leeway with what you can add, what you can contribute in your fictionalized work. But if you're making events up, if you're making people up, that's appalling. We do not support that. How do we know which bit is true then? This is the issue. The way that we know what is true is partly by doing our own research, by digging into the history, but also if you're reading fiction, if you're reading narrative non-fiction, anything that could be fictionalized or changed or made up, if you read it alongside a non-fiction book where it's much more likely to be true, then that's really helpful, because then you get the drama and the excitement of the fiction or narrative non-fiction, but you also get
what is hopefully the factual evidence in the non-fiction book. So you can read them side by side. And to be honest, it could be actually quite fun. It could be a fun, more holistic experience of history by engaging with the narrative non-fiction or the fiction with the non-fiction alongside it. So, it does require a little bit more reading. But, if you're interested in it, it's quite fun. So let's jump back to the issue at hand, how the removal of subjectivity, the removal of biases, can actually be a bias in itself. So we were just jumping into what a bias is and what objectivity is. So a bias is, to recap, a bias is any kind of political, ideological, religious, cultural, societal, or original subjectivity that comes into the writing or presentation of history. This might take the form of editorial subjectivity, choosing what to include and what not to include. It could include the way in which the history is presented, the location that the history is presented in, the era that the historian is living in, the wider political situation, and the international context of the time. All of these are biases. So true objectivity, therefore, is the removing of these biases. It's the removing of these biases. So it is the removal of anything that could tinge your work with an angle or an influence. But this then raises the issue. In order to remove these subjective biases, subjectivity is required to be employed. There is very little opportunity, very little possibility of subverting these biases without using subjective discernment to do so. Put simply, the historian is the one deciding what is a bias and what is not. A historian is the one deciding whether this sentence, this piece of work was biased or whether it isn't. That is a subjective opinion. And so it makes it very difficult to create objective work when subjectivity is used to try and create objective work. So the work then becomes tinged, impacted, influenced, affected by another bias, that of editorial subjectivity. This kind of harks back to what we started the previous live with, the words of W.H. Walsh, who said that the issue of objectivity and subjectivity in history is the most important and baffling topic in all of critical historiographical philosophy. It could not be more true. It is mysterious, it's baffling, but it is hugely important, crucially important. What has also become a major issue nowadays is the increase in religious, political, ideological, and cultural views and opinions. For the ancient historians, they tended to write according to what was the most widely accepted religious beliefs of the culture. Like with Herodotus, he was writing to inform and perpetuate this hero culture that they had in ancient Greece. The polytheistic religions of both ancient Greece and Rome played large roles in dictating how history was written, presented, and discussed. It was that and their view of the barbarians that influenced their writing. Everyone that didn't speak their language, everyone that came from a different place, everyone that wasn't part of Roman culture, Greek culture, was viewed as a barbarian. And so this view impacted the way that they wrote history. Because if you're viewing yourself as superior, if you're viewing everyone else as a barbarian, it's going to impact the way that you're writing history. because things then become moralistic, and history can then become, here's why we are better than the barbarians. Nowadays, there are hundreds of ideologies, religious doctrines, worldviews, and opinions that play a role in the presentation of history. The market, so to speak, has become a lot more saturated. It is incredibly fragile to try and walk on the glass structures of modern opinion and politics. This is something that we discussed in the previous live as well with James and a couple others. That modern politics, modern culture, is incredibly sensitive. It's incredibly fragile to try and walk on the glass structures that we have created when writing history. To agree with one person is to disagree and potentially offend another. This is going to impact the way that you write history. Writing an objective history has also become a lot more difficult in that respect too. Historians need to carefully remove their biases without offending or alienating another part of society by these edits and removals. So you remove this one thing and you offend one group, you put it back in and you offend another group. This is the issue that you need to contend with. This is the issues that historians need to try and balance. It's a confounding and dangerous world that historians now exist in, even when they're solely focused on the past. Historians, their primary role is to look at, explore, analyze, and present the past. But it is the modern world that we are often most affected by. So at this point, it's difficult to see how objectivity can actually ever be achieved. By the looks of things, it can't. However, it is an aim that every historian must continually strive. As mentioned earlier as well, to find an answer as to whether true objectivity can ever be reached, it is actually quite impossible. It's quite impossible, as history is written by humans, and humans are unavoidably opinionated. It seems like a struggle that might never really be rewarded too well. That is the issue. Everyone has opinions, everyone has views, everyone has beliefs, everyone has ideologies, whether they'll admit it or not. And that impacts the way that people write history and the way that people receive history. And so it's very contentious, very issue, a very large issue. Modernity, the modern world, calls for objectivity. And yet, modernity ultimately forces subjectivity into the work. At risk of sounding like a communist, the globalization, popularization, and commercialization of history and historiography has meant that the objectivity is both demanded and refused. The unrealistic expectations of being able to effectively balance the demands of the modern audience with their demand for objectivity has ultimately left the modern historian in a position where they are forced to sacrifice one for the other. This is the issue. This is the balance that historians have to wrestle with. Will they sacrifice objectivity so that they might be able to make a living? Will they sacrifice one issue in order to pander to, placate, inform, engage with another issue. And in all of this, it has to be said, and I've said it numerous times before, but it has to be said that sometimes this isn't a bad thing. Sometimes it's not bad to have the biases. Sometimes it's quite a good thing. Because in a lot of history, especially around the Holocaust, it's probably good to have a bias towards presenting the Holocaust as a real event that happened. It's probably a good bias to have. And with the rise of Holocaust denial and the fact that social media has given a massive platform to people who deny the Holocaust, it's probably a good idea for historians who write about the Holocaust to have the bias of wanting to present it as a real event that really happened and cost millions and millions of lives. So sometimes biases are a very good thing. Other times they can be quite dangerous, they can be quite misleading, and they can be quite impactful. So that's kind of the end of my spiel, the end of my personal discussion with the issue of objectivity. I'm not sure that objectivity can ever truly be achieved, but it is definitely something that we should strive towards. We should strive to write history and create history that is faithful to the truth, that is faithful to the facts that we have. We have to have integrity around the history that we write, that we're not just making things up, that we're not just throwing things in there because we think it sounds good or it's nice, but we're actually being faithful to the reality, faithful to what actually happened, faithful to what the sources say. And source analysis and the use of sources, that's a whole other issue that we can discuss as well. But as a rule of thumb, it's going from the sources outwards instead of your idea to the sources. You let the sources dictate the points you make instead of your points you're trying to make dictate what sources you look at, as a general rule of thumb. So if you want to read more about this topic, if you want to engage with it a little bit more, you can actually visit the Present History website, presenthistory.co.uk. We have a whole blog post about this where it's written more articulately than I've said it. And there's also a section at the bottom of further reading, so you can engage with different books, articles, topics around this issue, because this is a massive conversation to have. It's a fascinating conversation to have, and one that we do need to have. So I know we've got 2 people watching at the moment. If you guys have any, thank you for the compliment on the shirt. Appreciate that. But if you have any comments, thoughts, ideas, I know that James, you're here and you've had some good ideas and we've had a good conversation about it. So if anyone has any ideas or thoughts, you can drop those in the comments. But if not, it's been good to be on the live. It's fascinating. Make sure to check out presenthistory.co.uk where you can grab some more information, engage with the further reading. And also, you might have seen on the page that we have a project, a multimedia project that is currently going on called Hitler's Kingdom Come, where we look at a British cult that worshipped Hitler as the second coming of Christ. And that's including podcasts, blog posts, TikTok videos, Instagram videos. We're going multimedia with this thing. We're going multimedia with this project. So I would encourage you to go watch the videos, go listen to the podcast episodes, and engage with that as well. Leave your comments, leave your feedback. It's always good to hear from you. So yeah, engage with that, enjoy, follow, like, subscribe, whatever, you know the drill. And yeah, it's been great to chat to you. Thank you for those who did come and watch. And yeah, maybe we'll do another one of these sometime soon. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of the day, fantastic evening. In England, it's about 5:20, so it's getting into the evening. So I hope you have a great evening wherever you are, great time wherever you are, and we'll see you hopefully in a new live sometime soon. See you later.